Well, I want to welcome people to the Happy Learning Hour. I'm very honored to have people sign up and register, and it's really my first attempt at this, and particularly honored that I have Ashton Applewhite here to have a conversation with. Hold on a second, I want to make sure all this is working. I saw a hand up, hold on. Well, I think we're good to go. So, all right. So here we are, Happy Learning Hour, and I'm glad to be with all of you. What I want to do tonight is explain how I met Ashton, what I've learned from her, and then she and I are going to have a short conversation, probably 15, 20 minutes, and then we really want questions from all of you. So if you'll put your questions in the chat, and if you're familiar with Zoom, your chat button is at the bottom of your screen, and just, type in your questions. And I've got a friend, Marie, who's going to moderate these questions, and Ashton will answer questions, probably the last 20, 30 minutes. So we really want a conversation among people here. So as we're talking, please think of questions and put them in the chat, all right? So again, I'm Jann Freed. I'm very thrilled you're here. I'm here with Ashton Applewhite. And I discovered Ashton through actually a newsletter, Next Avenue. And if you are not familiar with Next Avenue, it's an online newsletter put out by the public broadcasting system in Minneapolis. I highly recommend it. Just Google Next Avenue, and I just love it. Now, again, it's targeted for people 50 plus, but that's how I discovered Ashton. And then from her article, I discovered her TED Talk, and then I interviewed Ashton for my monthly podcast, which is called Becoming a Sage. And I just want to check this again. You can hear me, Ashton? Everything okay? Great.
All good.
So I interviewed Ashton, and but before I did, I read her book, which is called This Chair Rocks. We had it in the invitation in the.
You got to give the whole title.
You're right. This Chair Rocks: A Manifesto Against Ageism.
It's not a book about chairs.
What's that?
It's not a book about chairs.
There's nothing. Actually, there's nothing in here about chairs. But before I interviewed Ashton, I read the book, and honestly, of course, this is my passion, so I'm underlining almost every page. But I wanted to share with you a few things that I underlined, and then Ashton and I are going to talk for a little bit, and then we want to open it up to questions. So just a few things as I was reviewing what I underlined. It says, and again, another thing I like about Ashton's book is it has resources. It's full of resources, full of research. This isn't just her opinion. She really has done her homework here, and that's impressive. But I'll just start off with, in Lynn Siegel's philosophical take in her book, Out of Time, The Pleasures and the Perils of Aging, what really matters are the narratives we create, the stories we tell ourselves of how to be our age as we age. The central task, in other words, is to figure out what's us, age appropriate, at any point, not necessarily what biology predicts or an ageist culture ordains. There's no such thing as age appropriate. So, this whole idea of, we're going to explore that.
Except for children, I would add that qualifier. For adults, there's no such thing.
Right. Yeah. And we're going to explore these topics. And Ashton, you can take it anywhere you want. But here's another line I underlined, or a quote. The great thing about getting older, according to writer Madeline L'Engle, is that you don't lose all the other ages you've been. And rather, instead of agelessness, it's agefulness. So I like some of those things that you say there. Then I like this. And this is actually one of my favorite terms that Ashton has coined here. She talks about an old person in training. We're becoming an old person in training means ditching preconceptions, looking at and listening carefully to elders around us, and re-envisioning our place among them. So one of the things that I often talk about is looking for role models. Who's living a life that looks appealing to you? And actually, I could tell one quick story. I was doing a workshop and talking about this, and one young woman, it was for women accountants, and this one CPA, she was probably 30, and she said, you know, my grandmother is a perfect example of a sage. And I said, well, tell me about that. And she said, I asked my grandmother, you know, how did you learn to live life the way you're living? She said, I always looked for a role model who was at least a decade older than me, somebody who I really admired. And I just thought, I want to live like that person. And so, you know, again, this idea of, you know, looking for role models, looking for positive people in our lives. And I want to share one other thing, and then I'm going to let Ashton take it away. But when I interviewed Ashton for my podcast, the big aha for me, now she does talk about it in her book, but I loved hearing it from her, was internal ageism. You know, what is it we think about ourselves, which is kind of that narrative story again. You know, what do we see? What do we think about ourselves when we look in the mirror? And, you know, I always say we have to push back against what society is telling us, because so much of society is anti-aging. Instead of saying, you know, I'm going to embrace who I am. And I find myself, you know, I'm guilty of that too. You know, I think I look okay until I look in a magnified mirror, you know, and then it's like, whoa, okay. So anyway, I'm going to let you take it away, Ashton. And you know, I just wanted to kind of tee it up for you in terms of, you know, some topics that really resonated with me.
Well, you know, everything connects to everything else. The idea of internalized ageism is, I mean, ageism is any judgment about a person or a group of people on the basis of age. It can be like you're too young as well. So right. Everyone experiences it. Older people bear the brunt of it because we live in a society that bombards us with messages all the time about how awful aging is and equates, you know, getting older with becoming ugly and useless and all that stuff. And I want to be very clear. Sometimes I think of myself as being in the both sides of the story business. There are legitimate things to worry about getting older, you know, running out of money, ending up alone, the decline of physical function, which is inevitable and which frankly sucks, you know, and that stuff is real. So I don't ever want to seem like I'm painting that over into sort of happy talk. Mm-hmm. But an ageist culture drowns out all but the negative, right? All we hear is the negative, when in fact, I've never met anyone, no matter how apprehensive they are, who actually wants to be any younger. Mm-hmm. Everyone, you know, I try it out as a thought experiment and people go, oh, great. Oh, wait, because none of us really want to wipe the slate clean and go back to where we are, because we know what Madeleine L'Engle says is true. We know the epigraph to the book is another take on the same idea, that we contain all the ages we have ever been, right? That we are who we are because of that, all that experience, right? So let's look at aging in all its fullness and not brush away the fears, but to put them in context, which are also that, you know, aging enriches us, deepens us, and you know, especially for women, I think late life is often the best time of all.
Right. Well, and so much does depend on context, because depending on who's in the room, we might be younger, you know?
Well,
so we're not always the oldest person in the room. One of the things that I really stressed on this when we were promoting this tonight is ageism in the time of COVID-19. So you have some interesting thoughts that this truly was an aha to me. So talk about that. And
sure.
Yeah.
I mean, you should know that my website is thischairrocks.com, same as the first part of the book title, and I have been blogging. There's, you know, a link to the blog right up front, and I've been, you know, the book came out a couple years ago, so I continue to write and think out loud on the blog. So that is where people for free can find my most recent thoughts. I've been writing a lot more, partly because I haven't had to get on an airplane, which I have to say I kind of like, although I'm sure I'll get sick of it.
Talk about, just mention your other website too, so people have that.
There are a couple. There's This Chair Rocks, which is my main website. It links to another blog called Yo, Is This Ageist, which is modeled on, with permission, a pre-existing site called Yo, Is This Racist, which is a Q&A blog started by a guy who realized, we're uncomfortable talking about race. Ask me. We are, I think, less uncomfortable talking about ageism, but we are even more ignorant because these are new ideas. So that is a place where you can send me a picture, a link, something you've seen or heard or perhaps done, and say, what do you think? Is this ageist or not? Because these are new ideas. We're all figuring this stuff out, right? Everyone is ageist. And also on a website I don't know if you know about, Jann, but it's called Old School, oldschool.info.
Excellent.
And it is a clearinghouse of free, vetted anti-ageism resources, talks, blogs, workshops, videos, animations, academic papers, but most of it's for the general public, because movements need tools. And what I'm up to, with the help of anyone who'll listen, including you, Jann, is to help catalyze a grassroots movement like the women's movement. Because think about what the women's movement did to bring visibility to the discrimination that women face, and to give us voice and visibility. We need exactly that around age and aging, to give people, visibility. So where was I? Internalized ageism.
We were talking about COVID-19.
Oh, COVID-19, right. So the big thought experiment I am lobbing, like if I played sports, I could have a better metaphor, but sort of, I guess in football, where you kick the ball all the way down the field, is imagine. COVID has done so much at hideous human cost to expose not just ageism, but ableism, prejudice against people with disabilities, because our fates are very linked. And often we are one and the same in ways that a lot of people don't want to acknowledge because it's scary, but it's true, and we need to acknowledge it and join forces. So the original messaging around the virus was, frankly, wash your hands, but don't sweat, because it's really only going to affect the old and the ill. And this is true around the world. I first read about it, it seemed obvious to me, but I like to check my own prejudices, because obviously I am biased. The Director General of the World Health Organization talked in March about how ageism was slowing the global response. So think, and I urge you to ask people to do this if you feel like it, think what the economy, the infection rate, the death rate, pick your index, would look like if we had known from the beginning that the virus was also going to attack the young and the healthy. And, so that if you want in one, quick snapshot, evidence of the global and lethal consequence of ageism, this pandemic is providing us with that. It's also, as we see now, the death toll disproportionately around people of color, and see how it is exposing vulnerable populations of all types, exposing the way all these prejudices compound and reinforce ech other.
Yeah, that's definitely true.
Yeah.
In fact, I was talking to a doctor the other day just about this fact that so many African Americans, are dying at such a higher rate. So it is,
and that's because of the legacy of systemic racism. It's because that was first framed by the Surgeon General. That's because there's more drinking and more drug use. No, it's not the fault of these people. It is because they are facing the legacy of a lifetime of reduced access to healthcare, to secure housing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, which makes them more vulnerable.
Exactly. I was reading an article, I think it was yesterday, it might have been the Washington Post, about in Detroit, a young man, his stepfather ended up dying. Yeah,
his father and his grandfather.
And they'd gone to 3 hospitals.
Yeah.
Couldn't get anyone to test them. And it just breaks your heart. So,
And nursing homes, where it's an epicenter, so many clusters, and nursing homes are not getting tests. They are not getting PPE. The PPE is going to hospitals. And once again, it's intersectional because the people at almost equal risk are the frontline workers, who care for people in nursing homes, who themselves do not have the PPE, cannot afford to stay home and lose their jobs. So they are at risk. They are placing their families at risk, and they are spreading the disease because they can't afford to stay home and they are themselves not protected. So we're all in this together.
yes, there's no doubt we're in this together. And, again, one of the things that I hope comes out of this is we're talking about a lot of these frontline workers. And I love that we're calling them essential workers.
I do too.
Because I hope that essential can translate into, affordable living.
Decent wages.
Decent wages, exactly.
And I do think healthcare is a human right.
Yes, I do too. Well, Ashton, share a couple more things and then we'll open it, because truly I really want some interaction from
a thought on old person in training.
Yes.
I heard the phrase from a geriatrician named Joanne Lynn. When did I start? I started my blog in 2007. So I've been at this for a while. And I heard the phrase early on when I struggled for quite a few years to find my way. And I thought, well, I don't know what that really means, but it's what I have become. And where I think it's a useful idea in the ways that you said, find people who are doing things you think make sense, or perhaps even things that you don't make sense or that harm them. And you want to avoid those kind of behaviors. But all prejudice relies in othering, seeing a group of people as other than ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
The weird thing about ageism is that other is our own future older selves. Ageism takes root in our reluctance to acknowledge that we are going to get old, that if there is more road behind us than ahead, we might even be old or, older, whatever, and to acknowledge that instead of spending all this energy trying to fight it or deny something we know, happens to us every single day. We wake up a day older. So becoming an old person in training is an imaginative, it's just a little tweak of thinking. It's just acknowledging that someday you will be that older person. The earlier in life we make that leap, the better off we are, because then you don't get sucked into fearing and pretending that you can avoid the inevitable. And the earlier in life we start actually looking at the older people around us instead of past them, or pretending that they're not there, the more likely we are to have friends of all ages. It's incredibly important to have younger and older friends. So find something you like to do, think of something you like to do, and find a mixed age group to do it with, right? But then younger people can see us, people like us, and go, gee, she's ancient, but she seems to be having a pretty good time, or whatever, and we olders are reminded of how hard it is to be young. And then it's very hard to hold on to stereotypes when you are with a mixed age group.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And it reminded me just of a quick story. There was a great documentary. Of course, I loved it a few years ago, and I think it was nominated for an Oscar. I don't think it got it, but it was called Young at Heart. And it was a documentary about a men and women singing group. So an older singing group. Everybody was like over 70. And they traveled around and performed. And I knew I wanted to see it. And so my oldest son, he was just out of college, I think, or maybe a senior. So he was probably 22, 23. He was home for the summer and he said, Mom, I'll go to the movie with you. And I said, well, honey, you're not going to want to. There's no action. I doubt there's love. It's going to be slow. And he goes, it's okay. I'll go with you. So we go to this movie and I'm loving it. And about halfway through, I lean over and I said, what do you think? And he goes, oh, I like it. I like it a lot. Well, I couldn't believe it. So on the way home, I said, well, what did you like about it? And I'll never forget this. He said, it was so nice to see older people happy, hope. He said, it gives me hope. He said, it was so nice to see people enjoying their lives, and here they were singing. And then I was also, when you were talking about seeing older people, not seeing past them, but seeing them. You know, I just blogged about losing John Prine and the song that he kind of made famous, Hello in There. Yeah. Which is all about seeing people and acknowledging them. Yeah.
Which is how we undo, you know, all prejudice. I mean, it was, you know, it's you'll forgive me for putting it so in this way, but it was ageist of you to assume that just because he was young, he wouldn't like it. I think we older people do. We live in a society that so undervalues older people that it's like, oh, if there's no, you know, young people in the room, who will my kid have to talk to? Well, they could talk to any of the 35 super interesting older people. And our own internalized ageism, our own assumption, I mean, it takes courage to go over. You're at a party, we tend to make a beeline for people our own age. Try to beat that habit, because, you know, maybe there's one person in the room who's like, oh crap, I have to talk to this old biddy. But that is not the person who's ever going to change the world or be your friend. And most people are either neutral on it, like, I'll talk to this person about whatever. Age says nothing about what we're interested in, about what kind of music we like, about what we read this morning, about what we do with our time, right? Except unless it's like extreme physical activity, you know, otherwise there's really nothing that age is a barrier to having a common interest or common thing we can do. And I think we think it's much bigger than it is, especially if we're older. And I think younger people are actually less prejudiced than we imagine, but we're sort of self-protective. So try that the next time you're at an event. Try not to just go hang with someone your own age. Try to break that habit, which we all have. No judgment.
Right. No, that's great advice. Well, I'd like to turn to the questions, because, you know, whenever I'm on a line, I do have questions. So I want to make sure we have plenty of time and see what people want to know. Marie, you're going to help with the questions?
Yeah, absolutely. So Jennifer Segal says, bingo, our society does not value older people. I feel that all the consequences of COVID are highlighting these issues with long-term care. Can you comment on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think I have commented on it a little bit. You know, both, I mean, it is, I just saw a horrifying story in the Washington Post this afternoon saying that data is now starting to come out of Europe saying that 50% of deaths there have occurred in long-term care, exacerbated by the fact that family was prevented, you know, for legitimate, you know, epidemiological reasons from going to check on their loved ones in these homes. A society that doesn't care for older people doesn't care about the people who care for us and puts them, you know, and we are at higher risk. And that is why, you know, personal protective equipment and testing. I mean, I put it out. I am pretty active on social media, on Twitter, especially these days, also on Instagram and Facebook at This Chair Rocks. And what I, you know, tweeted was, look, the US has 2 to 3 weeks ahead. We're 2 to 3 weeks ahead of Europe. We can act now to prevent more deaths in the US, although there's still higher deaths here. That said, there's always two sides of things. You know, the measures that are increasing isolation among older people are also a necessary public health measure. I mean, one of the really interesting discourses is around, you know, should older people be, you know, should there be measures? I don't know, it's not saying, you know, mandating that older people stay home. Ideally, each decision would be made on the basis of health status. If you are there in the hospital, you know, there's a tremendous, terrifying stuff about medical triage in Italy in particular, which was so overwhelmed, having to decide in the split second, because when you are in that situation, you have to decide fast who gets a ventilator. That hasn't happened in the US. We have had enough ventilators, and it is unlikely to happen. But at the beginning, I was all up on my high horse about how this is ageism of the most lethal variety, and how can this happen? And I came to understand that it is not that these doctors are dying to kill old people, right? It is that they have to make a decision very fast, and that age is much quicker to assess than underlying health status. And now we know, of course, that healthy younger people are dying and 90-year-olds are recovering. So it's really that kind of hideous medical decision-making is being forced on society and these doctors, frontline people in particular, by systemic failures to care about the most marginalized people, but also, to fund the healthcare system, and not to close hospitals, and not to privatize healthcare, et cetera. So let's look carefully at placing the blame, broadly where blame is due. And just to finish the point, I think if we could take the word elderly and put a silver stake through its heart, there would be far fewer deaths, because I think so many older people like me are reluctant, understandably, to identify as older. I heard a lot of younger people saying, I can't get my parents to stay home. They're like, I'm not elderly, I can go do X, Y, Z. That's internalized ageism, when we don't want to acknowledge that we are older. I do not think rules should be put in place to make older people stay home, especially as in the months and perhaps years to come. But I do think that we olders need to acknowledge that we are more vulnerable simply because we are older, and to be more careful, not just to protect ourselves, but to protect everyone, just the way everyone should wear a mask, because we're all in this together and we don't know who the virus is going to strike. But our age does make us more vulnerable, and it's important not to be in denial about that.
Awesome. We have a bunch of questions coming in. So a follow-up question from Nancy Graham-Stock. Don't we need to improve long-term care in the future? How and what can we do?
That's a great question. And I just got invited today to be on a webinar with Penny Cook, who is the head of the Pioneer Network, which is a network of very progressive long-term care providers, and a guy who has this outfit called Link Senior, which is an association of senior homes. We do have, these places do incredibly important work, and it is just as the epidemic is raising awareness of ageism and ableism. It's also raising awareness of the vulnerability of long-term care people, both the people in it and the caregivers. So we have the industry itself, which does important and undervalued work, has an incredible opportunity to make the good work they do known, and to improve practices and to demand better treatment for them. So I don't work in long-term care, but follow me on social media to learn about these events, or look up the Pioneer Network and track it from a professional point of view, because we do need to improve long-term care. Where the part of that I'm working on is to help create culture change around the value we accord to the people who look after older people and those of us who receive it. Because without fundamental culture change, we're not going to achieve equal rights for older people anywhere, least of all when they're hidden from sight in residences.
From Katie Carter Frederick, how do we encourage a cross-generational society in which all are valued?
That's a huge question. It's a wonderful question. I wrote a book about it, so which answers the question in detail. I would urge you, the tool that catalyzed the women's movement was consciousness raising. And what happened around was that women came together in the 70s and 80s in particular and shared their experiences and realized that the barriers that they were encountering were not personal problems, but widely shared political problems that required collective action. And that is what we need to do around aging. The problem is not that I can't open the damn jar or that I have wrinkles. The problem is they should make the jar easier to open, and I shouldn't be discriminated against on this basis. So one of the resources, it's on Old School, and it's also on my website. A couple of things are there because I wrote them, is a free download called Who Me Ageist? How to Start a Consciousness Raising Guide around age bias. I'm also starting to lead them on a monthly basis, which you will find out about if you follow me on social media or subscribe to the Old School newsletter. We will not write you very often, and we will never give it away, I swear. Also, same is true if you subscribe to my newsletter, blah, blah. So because that is what catalyzes that leap of awareness to go, oh, it's not my failing, it's not my fault, it's structural, it's discrimination, and we can come together and do something about it. There's actually a name for that. It's cognitive liberation. It is the linchpin of movement building. So I would urge you to start a consciousness raising group around age bias, because the very first thing we do, and Jann, you referenced this, is look at our own attitudes towards age and aging, because we are all ages. We have had a lifetime of internalizing these messages, and most of us haven't thought to question them. And that's uncomfortable because we are all biased. But the minute you're over that hump, you see it in the culture around you, and that is liberating. So it's a big ask, but start a group, or just think about starting a group. Look at your own language towards age and aging as a starting point. And I urge you, if possible, to have people of all ages in it. And ideally have people who don't look like you in other ways, because that's how we learn about the systems around us that pit us against each other, which is what all prejudice does. And they need to work together for a fairer world for everybody.
Good advice.
Easy advice to give, hard to follow. I know that.
Julie Kirk says, personally, I witnessed my mom in a long-term care facility. I believe that a majority of these facilities do not have competent staff to take care of loved ones like they should be. This has to be improved. How can that happen? It isn't that they are not paying enough to live in these facilities.
No, it is not. It's interesting to answer that question with all the awareness of the vulnerable populations that are coming to light in COVID. I feel like I have a choir around me making this point. To me, it goes back to, I'm sort of a big picture culture change person. A society that doesn't value older people, doesn't value the people who work with us. We don't value geriatricians either. We don't value people. We don't value nursing homes in general. We certainly don't value care home workers. So we need culture change at the deepest level in order to improve, to give nursing homes and congregate care facilities the place in society that they deserve for the incredibly important work of looking after the people we love and possibly ourselves in the last years of our lives. Because they are undervalued, most of the work in these nursing homes is done by underpaid, often not documented, typically women of color who do not make enough money. No one trains them. So what we need to do, I think we need to give everyone a living wage, and we need to give everyone health care so that people can have the time to learn what people need in the face of COVID. These workers also need training in how to protect themselves from COVID, the people they're looking after from COVID, and avoid taking it home to their families, right? And in order to do that, I know this is a very big answer, but we have to address the problem at its structural levels, which is undoing ageism and ableism, discrimination against people with disabilities, who are typically, invisible and undervalued also, because an ageist and ableist world, and I think part of this is just human. We see a person in a wheelchair, a person curled up in a bed, and we project our fears onto them. And I think part of that is human. We grossly underestimate not just the value of their life, but the quality of their life. And the view from inside that experience is very different. If you, like me, are over 50, there's lots of things, mostly having to do with my body, that I can't do like I did before. And I miss some of them, but guess what? I've adapted. And that's what we continue to do as we age. So we really need culture change between our ears and in the culture at large to help people see that and to validate the people who work there and make sure, because they do this work, because they love it. They really care about the people they are with. These are intimate relationships. They're two-way relationships. How do we bring it? And, for that matter, the same goes to childcare. We're not a family-friendly society either. And that is, that you can even argue that's also a form of ageism. We don't value kids, really, in my opinion, because they don't vote and they don't have money.
Good point.
And women pay the brunt, pay the price, because we don't value women as much as we value men, and so on and so on. So we need to really attack the whole thing, but pick the way in that resonates for you. If you're, if that healthcare facility you think could do a better job, I suggest connecting with the Pioneer Network and seeing what they recommend, because they're experts in the field.
Kate Milligan says, what term do you prefer to show honor to older generations? For instance, some tribes or societies honor their elders. The language and labels are important.
Well, you're not going to like this, Kate, maybe, but I think the term elder is a beautiful word. I know that it's often used in African American communities and in indigenous communities. It's not part of my heritage, so I don't use it. And what you might be irritated with is me saying that I actually don't think that older people are more valuable or more important or higher on a hierarchy than younger people. I think every human being deserves to be seen and heard. And when I was writing the book, I literally got tired of typing, older people or older Americans, and I shortened it to olders and youngers. And those are the words that I use, which everyone understands, and which I like because it's value neutral, and because, Jann, you referenced, we are older than some people and younger than others. We age in relation to others. And in an ageist world, we're all terrified of ending up when does old age begin, or when am I old, or when do I pass from the third stage to the grim fourth stage when it all falls to shit? There is no dividing line between old and young. We age at different rates. So I like the word older because it breaks down that binary, and also because, a not so wonderful reason is that in an ageist world, many of us are reluctant to identify as old. I have to say, I call myself older all the time. Sometimes I call myself old, but it's much easier to refer to myself as an older woman than an old woman. And that's part of becoming an old person in training, right? If I acknowledge that I'm older, I get over this fake divide and acknowledge what is true. I'm 67, there's more road behind me than ahead. I am definitely in that camp, but there aren't two camps. There's never two camps. There's never a binary. So my fix is olders and youngers, and I'm both.
I like that, actually.
That's awesome. Caroline Blackwell says, Ashton, how and where have you seen olders working effectively across racial, ethnic, and cultural lines? You say we need culture trends between our ears. What strategies have you seen as most effective?
I can't speak to that because I'm just me, and I'm a writer, so I spend most of my time alone, being cranky and banging my head against the keyboard. I would look at organizations that do the kind of work that you're interested in. There's so many ways in, especially now, around Indigenous rights, around climate justice, around disability justice. If you're interested in ageism, see who follows me on social media, or who are the people that I quote and reference, and find your tribe.
Patrice Sayre says, when we did consciousness raising in the women's movement, it was important not just to do that work, but to translate it into action. What movements, organizations, political action groups do you see helping move ageism to a political platform?
That is a great question. Not everyone is an activist, God knows, or the world would be intolerable. And not everyone wants to do that. And so I just want to say, if all you want to do is just reflect on your own attitudes towards age and aging, whatever you do, even if you just change yourself, it changes the culture. Even if you just point out to someone gently when they make an ageist comment, that changes the culture. I love your question because a movement needs a million voices, and I can tell yours is going to be one of them. I wish I could say there's this fabulous organization. There is not yet one. AARP is frankly useless. And the Gray Panthers is pretty moribund. So I'm hoping that organizations develop. I do suggest that you look at Old School, because we do have a list of when we started Old School almost 3 years ago, one of the first sections we had to add was a campaigns section, which are global anti-ageism movements, not how to live forever, not how to be healthy, not how to age creatively, but anti-ageism movements. So I think you'll get your best examples there. And if you start one, baby, I will tell the world about it.
That's good.
All right, from Robert Rowenhurst, the one-woman show Elaine Stritch at Liberty won the 2002 Tony Award for Best Special Theatrical Event for Stritch, which she performed at age 77 on Broadway. Have you seen it? And if so, what do you think?
I saw an earlier show of Elaine Stritch's. I think she's pretty fabulous. And I think, I think anyone who is out in the world in an interesting way, an older person, is inspirational. That said, I have broken most of my friends of the habit of sending me videos of, older person doing insert unusual thing. My least favorite being jumping out of airplanes, maybe because I so do not want ever to jump out of an airplane. And those stories are wonderful. They're inspirational. But I also think it's important to remember that they are outliers, right? And that the media loves people doing, climbing Mount Everest, or, wouldn't a Japanese guy scale Everest in his 80s or 90s? And I think it was George Bush who jumped out of an airplane in his 80s, or, it's good to have these reminders of how people can continue to do things that most older people don't. But I think it's also important to remember that those pursuits take luck and usually money, and that you don't have to aspire to that height of remarkableness to age perfectly well. It is just fine to age however you want to age. If that means sitting on the porch swing, that's okay too.
From Penny Sullivan, do you have thoughts on how employers can optimize teams of employees from multiple generations in the workplace?
There are tons of people writing about that now, because the fact that experience is a liability in the workplace is so nutty, and many businesses are facing a worker shortage, and we have mounting evidence that mixed age teams are more effective. So I see, the great engine of capitalism in this case provoking good change and necessary change. There's tons of stuff on the web about managing multi-generational teams. Allcore.org does a lot of good work in this arena. I'm a cranky, self-employed, solitary person, so I can't tell you I can't tell you how to do it, but I can tell you that there is tons of stuff on the web where people who are very smart people who are addressing exactly this management challenge and opportunity, because when you have all ages at the table, as of course, and same is true if you have multiracial, many genders, you bring more perspective and you arrive at better solutions, especially in creative industries. But there are skills involved, and tons of HR companies are addressing this. So there's plenty of resources online about that.
Gail Drew says, what do you have against AARP?
I just wish AARP were more political, but that's my wish. I feel like they could be, their legal team is terrific. Everyone I've ever met who works there, and I've met quite a few, has been smart as a whip. I wish that they would be more like me. Which is not the business they're in. But think of what they could do if they created a place for older people facing workplace discrimination, which is the way most people encounter ageism, especially men. It's often the first form of discrimination white men encounter. Imagine if they just created a place, a website, a listserv where people could come together and share their stories and find community. And P.S., they could get a whole bunch of information for class action suits, or to see what people are doing, or to track companies that are malfeasant, etc. I feel, but I am a firebrand on one end of the spectrum. So it's totally not fair of me to say, I mean, I'll say, I wish they had more of a political consciousness like mine. Well, that's not their job. It's certainly not how they see their job. So let me say, I do know that. But I see as the nation's, giant lobby for older people, with ageism having a lethal consequence with what's happening in nursing homes, why isn't AARP using their big ass pulpit to call for mass institutional change, to press politicians to get some personal, protective equipment and testing kits into nursing homes right now?
Yeah, because they're not using their potential.
They're not.
Yeah, no,
They're
it's
not.
great.
And their magazine reaches more. It's the best read magazine in America. They could do so much with so little effort. That is not, that is not in my firebrand, department. But really, to speak out now in this 2-week window before we follow Europe as example. Hello, I don't hear anything.
Yeah, no, I hear what you're saying. Well, we have time for, I would say, 2 more questions. So fire them away.
Yeah, we have one from Beth Chrisman that came up in the Q&A list here. So I just spent 5 weeks with a parent in rehab center and have a good friend who is 87 years of age and living well on her own. I found that dealing with bureaucracy and confusing phone menus make it hard for older people to navigate medical and other systems on their own. Do you have thoughts on how to improve that situation?
I have thoughts on how to improve that situation for every person, because I bet that the difficulties that an older person has are the same difficulties that someone who perhaps is not a native English speaker has, or someone with a vision problem has, or even just someone super impatient like me. So those systems need to be better designed for everyone. That is the premise of universal design, which mainly has to do with accessibility for wheelchairs, and also subtitles for people who are hearing impaired, and audio recordings for people who are visually impaired, etc. A world, a community that works better for older people, works better for people with disabilities, works better for families. It means there's social services, it means there's parks, it means there's public transportation. So I think all those menus should be redesigned to be usable for everyone. Perhaps you think, an older person in mind, but what does an older person really mean? Sometimes some older people are super competent, right? And some younger people are technically, just to look at someone who's young, it doesn't mean that they wouldn't find that phone menu equally confusing and maddening. It needs to be designed better for the entire community. It's not just expensive things we do for old people, it's things we do to make things work better for the entire community.
Yeah, that's great. Marie, any more questions that you can see? Or?
Yeah, so I see that Judith Janes has her hand raised.
Oh.
So I'm going to allow her to talk.
Okay.
So she can ask her question.
Okay.
Hi, Judith, you're on.
Thank you. I read the book, Women Rowing North.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering what you think about it.
I like it. I wrote a blog post about it, so you can see what I wrote. I do feel that, and she says the biggest obstacle to older women finding our voices and achieving our potential is ageism. She is explicit about that, which makes me happy because, ageism paired with sexism, of course. I do see a ton of new books coming out and people talking about how this is the era of the older women. Can't remember the name. One woman talks about, and if you email me, I'll send you the name of the double of women coming together. She talks about the double helix of ageism and sexism, and of women of all ages coming together, older women joining forces with younger women to complete the unfinished business of the women's movement, which I really love. Let's close the damn gender wage gap so that women can choose whether or not to stay home with their children. The reason the gender wage gap persists is because it makes companies money. If they can exploit women, and if they can exploit women like you and me, Jann, think of how much less power, women of color have, and untrained women and undocumented have. So the gains that we put in place, I mean, I would love to see the Equal Rights Amendment passed, and we are close. Let's start from there.
Yes, we have to make sure we all vote, that's for sure. Well, I want to wrap this up because I want to be very respectful of everyone's time, and I'm going to throw out just I think it's always good to keep a sense of humor, and so I'm going to throw out just a couple things, and then I'll let Ashton close. And once again, I want to say thank you, Ashton, for joining me, and I want to thank everyone who's online. Thank you for registering and signing up, and thank you for asking questions. So just a couple things that might be funny, maybe not, but with COVID-19, my husband and I finally signed up for Netflix. So I started off with something that people said I should have seen a couple years ago, but Grace and Frankie. I mean, I find myself laughing. I find myself crying. I mean, I feel like they're really good friends of mine, and I can relate with both of them on various aspects. So I wanted to.
I like the way it shows older women and older men being sexual.
Yeah, I do too.
We didn't check that at the door. Why would we stop? Yeah.
No, I think they deal with very realistic topics that we should all be talking about, thinking about, and you laugh, you cry, and I think their acting is very good too. The other thing I want to throw out is last December we were in Park City, Utah, and we were going into this bar, and it was very crowded, and there was this huge sign, and it said, "Absolutely no one in without their ID." So I said to my husband, I said, I didn't bring my ID, and he said, "Oh, don't worry about it." So we get there, and the bodyguard or the bouncer, whatever you want to call him, he says, I said, "I don't have my ID." And he said, "It's okay." And I said, "No, it's not. Look at this big sign. It says no one gets in without an ID." And he goes, "Ma'am, it's okay." I said, "No, I cannot get in. I do." So anyway, I was having some fun with him. He said, "Ma'am, it's okay. You can get in." So anyway, well, Ashton, I'm going to let you have the last, I always like to end interviews with, what words of wisdom, or if we remember anything tonight, what's the most important thing, or what's something that I didn't ask you that people should know?
I think that we really have a remarkable opportunity to confront ageism. I mean, people who didn't know it's done more work than, 1,000 years of activism could. And I don't mean to be creepy and say like we should capitalize on the deaths of thousands of people. But if you're listening to this, I think it's because you're aware that ageism really does enormous damage. It cripples our sense of self. It keeps us out of work that we need and love. It segregates us. It casts this pall across our futures that is not based in fact. Again, it's not that the scary stuff isn't real. It's that our fears are so out of proportion to the reality. And one thing I always love to mention, and if you go on my blog, it's searchable by topic. Search for public health. Search for Levy, L-E-V-Y. Becca Levy does most out of Yale, does most of the research on this. That apprehension is bad for us. Our outsized fears about aging make us more vulnerable to the things we fear. She did a study a year and a half ago that showed that people, and the media usually frames it as more positive attitudes towards aging. I say fact rather than fear-based attitudes. Right? Because this is not happy talk, are less likely to develop Alzheimer's, even if they have the gene that predisposes them to the disease. So ageism actually also, it sickens the culture, it sickens our sense of self, and it is a physical risk. I feel like we have an extraordinary opportunity to build on the awareness of ageism that COVID has presented us with as a hideous human cost. And I would urge each one of you to take that awareness out in the world in whatever way and whatever form works for you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. Well, I always say, let's make the rest of life the best of life. So I say, let's go be Grace and Frankie. They make me laugh. So anyway, Well, Ashton, thank you so much. And
Thank you,
once
everyone.
again, I'm grateful for everyone who signed on. Thank you for your chat, your comments, your questions.
I'm going to write my websites here because I can type and talk at the same time. No,
Right,
I
put them
can't.
in the chat. And
This chair.
if you didn't have a chance to watch Ashton's TED Talk, I really encourage you to do so. She's dynamic. She tells great stories, and they're right on. So,
And my book is fun to read.
and your book is fun to read, and it's like I said, it's also full of resources. So I think that's really good. It's not just, you know, some of the books can be kind of light in this area, but no,
Oh no, I'm afraid I really did my homework. Wow.
No, she really did her homework. That's great. So let's all join the movement. If you're interested, let's join the movement and make something happen. So once again, thank you. We're going to get out of here on time. And I really appreciate it. And everybody stay safe, stay healthy,
Stay inside.
and stay inside and stay hopeful. Okay? Yeah. And make sure you vote. All right. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.